Welcome, rational thinkers and champions of evidence-based reasoning, to the Free of Faith podcast. This is the place where we dare to peel back the comforting but opaque layers of faith-based claims and expose their logical shortcomings. Today's topic is a big one. Would an actual loving God act as unlovingly as the God depicted in the Bible? We're going to examine some of the Bible's harshest stories and ask whether they reflect anything remotely resembling love as we understand it. Let's kick things off with one of the most infamous events, the Great Flood. According to the Bible, God became so displeased with humanity that he decided to wipe out every living being, men, women, children, and animals, by drowning them, sparing only Noah, his family, and the animals on the ark. Now, let's pause here. Imagine hearing a news story where a country's leader, enraged by crime rates, decides to flood the entire nation, killing not only criminals, but also millions of innocent citizens, including infants. You wouldn't think, how loving. You'd call it a monstrous atrocity. And yet, in this story, we're expected to see God's actions as an act of divine justice and mercy. How is that possible? Theologians often argue that the flood was necessary to cleanse humanity of its wickedness, a sort of divine reset. But here's the problem. Humans don't consider punishing the guilty alongside the innocent to be justice. It is instead indiscriminate cruelty. Let's turn to another troubling story, the command in 1 Samuel chapter 15, where God orders Saul to annihilate the Amalekites, including men, women, children, and innocent infants. This is not an isolated event in the Bible. Repeatedly, God is portrayed as authorizing or directly causing the deaths of innocents. Try to imagine this scene in your mind. An army approaches a village under orders to kill everyone, even children playing in the streets, mothers holding infants. It's horrifying. Yet, according to Scripture, this was carried out under divine instruction from an allegedly loving God. The most common defense here is that God's justice is inscrutable. We can't judge God by human standards, they say. But let's think about that for a moment. If God's love is fundamentally different from what we understand as love, then how are we supposed to trust any divine command? If love can include acts of mass slaughter, then love as defined by God becomes entirely meaningless. Love ceases to be recognizable as love. Let's ground this with a few analogies. Imagine you're a teacher in charge of a group of students. One of the students cheats on an exam, and instead of punishing the cheater, you expel the entire class, including those who didn't cheat. How would your students describe you? Compassionate? Just? Probably not. Yet this is precisely the logic at work in many biblical stories. The punishment isn't just collective, it's catastrophically disproportionate. Or imagine a mayor who, because one man broke the law, sets that man's entire neighborhood on fire. Everyone would rightly be horrified. Yet in the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, God destroys entire cities with fire and brimstone, sparing only Lot's family. Once again, innocent lives are wiped out indiscriminately, and we're told this is divine love and justice at work. What lesson is really being conveyed here? That might makes right? Does love include the capacity for indiscriminate violence? These stories raise profound questions about the kind of deity being depicted and the kind of relationship that deity demands from believers. According to the doctrine of original sin, every human inherits the guilt of Adam and Eve's disobedience in the Garden of Eden. As a result, humanity is condemned to a life of suffering and, ultimately, death. Imagine if you were punished for a crime committed by an ancestor from centuries ago. It wouldn't just be unfair, it would be absurd. In human terms, this would be a gross miscarriage of justice. Why then is it acceptable when God does it? This isn't just a question of fairness. It's about the coherence of the entire theological framework. We're told that God is both perfectly just and perfectly loving. But justice and love require accountability for one's own actions, not the inherited guilt of others. If divine justice punishes the innocent, along with the guilty, then it's no longer justice by any meaningful definition. Of course, some believers may argue that God's ultimate plan transcends human comprehension. Perhaps the suffering depicted in these stories serves a purpose we cannot understand. But this response conveniently places God's actions beyond critical scrutiny. If no action, no matter how cruel or irrational, can ever disqualify God from being called loving, then the concept of divine love is empty. It becomes an unfalsifiable claim. If God's ways are truly beyond comprehension, then how can anyone claim to know anything about Him, including His love and justice? This line of reasoning undermines the very foundation of faith, which relies on believers accepting certain claims about God's nature. If those claims can't be examined through reason and evidence, then what separates faith from blind obedience? So, where does that leave us? We're left with a depiction of God that is self-contradictory. The Bible presents a deity who demands love and devotion, but whose actions often inspire fear and confusion. Reason demands that we hold ideas to consistent standards. If a human being acted in the ways described in these biblical narratives, we would condemn them without hesitation. Why should we expect less from an all-powerful, all-knowing being? These stories challenge us to ask hard questions, not just about God's character, but about the entire framework of faith. Faith asks us to trust without question, but reason compels us to confront contradictions head-on. And when faith crumbles under the weight of its own inconsistencies, it's reason and evidence that remain standing. If this conversation has sparked some questions, or even some discomfort, that's a good thing. Questioning is the first step toward clarity. Don't settle for easy answers or platitudes. Dive deeper, explore further, and demand evidence. Head over to Free of Faith to read the full article and join the discussion. Let's keep this conversation going, because the pursuit of truth doesn't stop at questioning. It's about finding answers that actually make sense. Thank you for tuning in to the Free of Faith podcast, where we expose the logical failings of faith and celebrate the clarity that comes with reason. Until next time, stay skeptical, stay curious, and remember, rationality always outperforms faith. Engage reality, and I'll see you soon.